Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger with the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for August 15th, 2022. Today I want to look into two events which took place on this day in history, which highlight how the rigid adherence to neoliberal economic policies and neocon war policies for more than half a century have been responsible for plunging the United States and the world into a new dark age. This is a unipolar era, which hopefully is coming to an end. An era in which war and economic collapse has been on the agenda repeatedly, with full bipartisan support in the United States, and at present with all parties, all major political parties in Europe joining in on the insanity. The two events I want to talk about are what happened on August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon ended the era of Bretton Woods. And secondly, August 15th, 2021, when the U.S. ended its 20-year war in Afghanistan and left the country in shambles, and the reputation of the United States also in shambles. Now, these two events show why we need a new Bretton Woods, which is an improved version going back to the original idea of Bretton Woods and not to what it became under the control of the British Empire, and why we also need a new security architecture along with that. So let's go back to what happened starting in August 15th, 1971. There had been a several-year process of British attacks on the dollar and the Bretton Woods system, of speculative attacks, of the creation of what became known as the Eurodollar market. This preceded the petrodollar market, which was actually inaugurated in 1973 following an Arab-Israeli war. But what happened is that the British pound was devalued and there was enormous pressure on the dollar as countries were lining up, especially under British direction, to demand U.S. gold for the dollars they had in their banks. Now, there was a concerted effort to convince Richard Nixon that he had to end the Bretton Woods system, and this was led by George P. Shultz, who was a key figure in this group, Paul Volcker, and former Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns. There were others involved. Kissinger played a role. But most historians attribute the lead role to John Connally, who was the Treasury Secretary. But I spoke directly with Connally, who said that while he was the one who told Nixon that this had to be done, he was sent there by Volcker and Shultz, who convinced him that the dollar would be finished unless the United States took this measure. Now, what happened when Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system? Well, first, the Bretton Woods system was based on the idea of fixed and stable exchange rates for currencies. This was done to prevent speculators from driving down or raising the value of currencies based on flows of speculative funds. It also allowed capital and exchange controls to protect currencies from speculators. The decision by Nixon ended that. Importantly, it ended the gold reserve status of the dollar, taking the dollar off any connection with gold. It also was part of the process which led to an end to banking separation, the Glass-Steagall policy from 1933, which meant that investment banks and commercial banks had a wall of separation between them, and commercial banks could not engage in speculation. Over the next 28 years, this was under attack, again by figures in both parties. Now, this meant that the Bretton Woods system and the Glass-Steagall system, which allowed for the directing of investment into science and technology innovations that produced the annual increases in productivity of physical goods, that ended. That was phased out over the next 50 years. This began a 50-year decline of U.S. and Western economies. Policies of deindustrialization, outsourcing, privatization, free market, free trade, globalization, and an attack on national sovereignty. All of this was initiated by Nixon's actions on August 15, 1971. This collapse of the Western economy over the last 50 years was not the result of actions by Soviet communists or the Chinese Communist Party, but was done from the inside by the wealthiest corporate officials of the cartels, the financial cartels, insurance cartels, raw material cartels, and so on, big pharma and so on. When this occurred on August 15th, LaRouche issued a very sharp warning that was published under the headline, "Nixon Pulls the Plug," in which he said that we're going to see a move toward fascist austerity driven by ongoing debt crises and the devaluation of currencies. This was a move toward corporatism, or what LaRouche referred to as Schachtian economic policy, referring to Adolf Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. Now, LaRouche was recognized at the time by those pushing for this New World Order as a potential adversary. And this was one of the main reasons why the slanders and attacks began on LaRouche after 1971, escalating through the whole decade, and then reaching its peak in the early 80s when Ronald Reagan called on LaRouche to help him negotiate the Strategic Defense Initiative with the Soviet Union. But it was also recognized by the victims of these policies. LaRouche had meetings with numerous leaders of non-aligned nations, including Mexico's Jose Lopez Portillo, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And LaRouche's ideas were circulated throughout the world and are emerging again as we go into a new crisis. So the fight today is being led by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the fight for a new Bretton Woods, backed by a new financial and security architecture, which is based on the commitment for cooperation for economic development among sovereign nation states. And I'd urge you to look at the article, which I'm linking at the bottom of the description section today, by Paul Gallagher from February 21st, 2020, titled LaRouche's Physical Economy Method and a New Bretton Woods System. Now, the second event on August 21st was in 2021. The failure of the Unipolar War Party with their effort to carry out nation building in Afghanistan. More than $1 trillion was spent. It may be as much as 2 to 3 trillion. More than 3,500 U.S. and allied military officials or military members of the military lost their lives, with casualties far beyond that in post-traumatic stress syndrome and so on. Casualties among Afghan soldiers and civilians probably are higher than 1 million. There's no exact number on that. And a complete devastation of the economy, which has worsened since the U.S. troops evacuated on August 15th, 2021. There was a report from the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, in which he concluded, quote, "If the goal of the war was to rebuild and leave behind a country that could sustain itself and pose little threat to the United States' national security interests, the overall picture is bleak." That is a classic understatement. Look at Afghanistan today. The nation is broke. Its banks don't function. Most have been shut down. People cannot withdraw their savings and have cash. The U.S. stole between $7 and $9 billion in Afghan reserves that had been deposited in Western banks, a foretaste of what would come with the $300 billion stolen from Russia. Huge amounts of money went to corrupt Afghan officials and U.S. military and security contractors, unaccounted for. Today, more than half the people of Afghanistan are hungry. More than 1 million children are malnourished and face death by starvation. And according to UN estimates, 97% of the people in Afghanistan are in danger of falling below the poverty line this autumn. Now, the war hawks and neoliberals behind these policies, especially the war hawks behind the endless wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East, are at it again. This time in Ukraine, targeting Russia, and in Taiwan, targeting China, and moving in as aggressively as they can in Africa to counter the efforts of China and Russia at actual nation building through infrastructure investment. In the next month, the Schiller Institute will have a number of events which will detail the effects of these policies, as well as put forward the life work of Lyndon LaRouche in promoting development policies on regional and national efforts to create a viable economic system, a new Bretton Woods. In September, we'll have an event on the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth. Join us. We must put an end to this 50-year descent into a new dark age. We know how to do it, and the support is growing for this, especially in the nations that are the obvious victims in the global south and the former non-aligned nations. But don't be smug if you live in the United States or Western Europe. Your time is coming for this descent into a dark age. We're already well on the way. Join us to reverse this. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow.